Welcome to the world of science fiction story, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. No one has ever touched me without fear until you, human. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The ship's alarms blared a discordant wail of failing systems and imminent disaster, but Roger Cade barely noticed. His focus remained on the viewport where streaks of fire lashed across the black void of space, remnants of the orbital chase that had led him into this mess. The mercenaries had been relentless, tailing him through the asteroid belt, forcing him to push his engines beyond their limits. Now he was paying the price. The control panel flickered in warning, multiple systems failing at once, and the telltale shudder beneath his feet told him what he already knew. His ship wasn't going to make it. The planet below loomed large, an expanse of deep emerald and obsidian mountain ranges with thick jungle canopies veiling whatever horrors lay beneath. A world spoken of in hushed tones across the outer colonies, a place known for its ruthless warriors and deadly terrain. It was not the place to crash land, if one had a choice. But choice had abandoned him somewhere between the second and third missile impact, and now gravity had taken hold, dragging him down in a rapid spiraling descent. Roger wrestled with the controls, trying to angle his descent into something survivable. The ship groaned as it bucked against his commands, a vessel that had seen too many near deaths, and was finally meeting its end. The atmosphere roared around him, flames licking the edges of his viewport as the hull temperatures climbed dangerously high. He grit his teeth and braced himself as the final stabilizer blew out, sending him into freefall. The jungle canopy met him like a titan's fist, branches snapping, metal shrieking, the force of impact slamming him forward against his harness. Sparks rained from the exposed wiring as the ship skidded through dense undergrowth, carving a deep wound into the alien terrain before finally grinding to a smoking halt. For a long moment, there was only silence. Roger forced his breathing to steady, wincing as pain bloomed along his ribs, bruised but not broken. He unfastened the harness with a sharp exhale, the muscles in his arms trembling from the adrenaline crash. His ship was a wreck, the control panel flickering weakly before giving up altogether. No distress beacon, no shield, no weapons. He was well and truly stranded. Staggering to his feet, he surveyed the wreckage. The hull was split in multiple places, steaming from the friction of descent. One wing had been torn off entirely, its remnants buried somewhere in the jungle. The dense foliage around him was eerily still, the air thick with humidity and the scent of scorched metal. He was alive, but for how long? A low growl rumbled from the shadows beyond the wreck, and Roger's muscles tensed. His hand drifted toward the pistol holstered at his thigh, his instincts honed from too many years in the outer rim where survival depended on reaction speed and sheer audacity. He turned slowly, scanning the undergrowth. The growl came again, this time closer. Yellow eyes gleamed between the thick vines, tracking him with predatory patience. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "Didn't even get 5 minutes." The creature emerged, sleek, feline, but far too large. Its muscular frame covered in black iridescent scales that shimmered as it moved. Its fangs dripped with something that hissed when it touched the ground, acidic venom pooling where its saliva landed. It crouched, coiling for a lunge, and Roger had just enough time to draw his pistol before a sudden, piercing whistle cut through the air. The beast hesitated then, as if recognizing something far more dangerous than itself. It let out a chuff of displeasure and slunk back into the shadows. Roger exhaled, his grip still firm on his weapon. He turned his head slightly, taking in the figure that now stood on the ridge above his crash site. She was tall, her silhouette sharp against the hazy green light filtering through the jungle. Her skin, a shade of deep jade, gleamed where the light touched it, the black tribal markings along her arms pulsing faintly. Her silver eyes locked onto his, unreadable, unflinching. A long, sinuous tail curled behind her, the movement almost lazy, but Roger had been around enough warriors to know restraint when he saw it. This was no mere bystander. This was a predator choosing not to strike yet. She descended with measured steps, her posture fluid, controlled. Even as she drew closer, Roger noticed that she maintained a certain distance, a deliberate caution that felt almost unnatural. Not fear, something else. "You are not from here," she said, her voice low, smooth, carrying an accent that curled around the edges of her words. "That obvious?" Roger replied, holstering his pistol but keeping his hands loose at his sides, ready if needed. She tilted her head slightly, studying him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "Your presence is unwelcome. Outsiders do not last long on Xeris." "Yeah, well, not exactly a planned visit," he said, gesturing vaguely at the wreck behind him. "Mind pointing me in the direction of the nearest repair shop?" She didn't smile, didn't react at all. "You are fortunate I arrived when I did. The shadow beast would have torn you apart. Don't suppose you called it off out of the kindness of your heart." She regarded him for a long moment, then turned. "Follow." Roger hesitated. She hadn't offered a name, and he knew better than to blindly trust the first person he met on an unknown world, especially one as infamous as Xeris. But his options were limited, and staying with his wrecked ship meant an eventual and unpleasant death. He fell into step behind her. As they walked, he noted the way the jungle seemed to part for her, the creatures lurking in the shadows giving her a wide berth. There was something about her presence, something unspoken but absolute. After several minutes, he finally broke the silence. "So, do I call you my rescuer, or do you prefer mysterious alien warrior?" She didn't glance back. "Talon." He nodded. "Talon, then. I'm Roger Cade." She still didn't turn, but he could almost hear the weight in her next words. "I know." That gave him pause. "You do." Talon finally stopped, just enough for him to nearly bump into her before he caught himself. When she turned to face him, her glowing silver eyes locked onto his with an intensity that made his breath hitch. "Your kind are rare here, but not unknown. I have seen records of your people. Humans. Small, fragile, reckless." Her gaze flickered down to where his hand had brushed against his pistol earlier. "And yet you did not run from me." Roger met her stare evenly, a slow grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've never been the running type." Talon exhaled, something between a sigh and a scoff. "Foolish." She turned, leading him deeper into the jungle. "But perhaps that is why you are still alive." And with that, Roger followed, stepping into the unknown with nothing but a broken ship, a dangerous guide, and the feeling that he had just become part of something far bigger than he understood. The jungle of Xeris was a living thing, dense with unseen movements and the whisper of unseen creatures. Its massive trees stretched high into the sky, with vines thick as a man's arm curling down like grasping fingers. The air was heavy with moisture, the scent of damp earth and alien flora filling Roger's lungs as he followed Talon deeper into the undergrowth. His boots sank slightly into the moss-covered ground, each step sending tiny luminescent spores swirling up from the vegetation, glowing faintly before fading away. It was an eerie, beautiful place, but the feeling of being watched never left him. The rustling in the shadows, the distant guttural calls of creatures unseen, the strange hum of the environment itself. It was clear that this world was built to consume the weak. Talon moved like she was part of it, her steps soundless, her presence commanding without effort. Every motion she made was precise, deliberate, as though she understood the very rhythm of the jungle itself. She hadn't spoken since introducing herself, and Roger was starting to wonder if that was just how she operated, silent, focused, and completely unreadable. The distance she maintained between them was exact, calculated, always just far enough that he couldn't accidentally brush against her. He had noticed it before, but now, walking behind her through the thick terrain, it was impossible to ignore. So Roger finally broke the silence, ducking beneath a low-hanging vine that seemed to pulse faintly with some internal bioluminescence. Are you always this talkative, or is it just because I'm human? Talon didn't break her stride, didn't even glance back. I do not waste words. Well, that's efficient, Roger muttered, wiping a sheen of sweat from his forehead. You know, I get that my kind might not be too popular around here, but I'm getting the feeling that you don't spend a lot of time talking to anyone, period. There was no immediate response, just the soft sound of her boots against the jungle floor, the shifting of leaves as she pushed forward. Then, at last, she said, "You assume much." "Yeah, well, it's a talent," Roger said, stepping over a gnarled root that coiled like a serpent across their path. "But let me guess, people don't get too close to you, do they?" This time Talon did stop. It was sudden enough that Roger nearly walked right into her, but he caught himself at the last second, taking a careful step back. When she turned, her silver eyes locked onto him, glowing faint in the dim jungle light. Up close, her expression was unreadable, but there was something there, something just beneath the surface. Not anger, not annoyance, something older, something deeper. "You think yourself perceptive," she said quietly, and there was something sharp in her tone, not quite a warning, but close. "You speak of things you do not understand." Roger held her gaze, reading the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers flexed slightly before curling into fists. He wasn't wrong. He could see it now. The way she carried herself, the way she always kept distance between them, the way her voice, even when calm, held a weight most people never had to bear. "You're right," he admitted, his voice softer now, less teasing. "I don't understand. But I do notice things, and I know what it's like to be on the outside looking in." For a moment, she said nothing. Then she turned sharply and resumed walking. "Keep up." Roger exhaled, shaking his head before falling back into step behind her. Whatever he had touched on, it wasn't something she wanted to discuss. Not yet, anyway. They walked for what felt like hours, though time felt strange here, the perpetual haze of the jungle making it impossible to tell if the sun had moved at all. The deeper they went, the thicker the vegetation became, massive roots rising like walls, the air growing dense with the scent of something electric, almost metallic. At some point, Talon raised a hand, signaling him to stop. Roger froze immediately, every muscle tensing. She tilted her head slightly, listening. Then, slowly, she extended a single clawed finger, pointing toward a clearing just ahead. Roger followed her gaze and felt his stomach tighten. The remains of a wrecked ship, much smaller than his own, lay half buried in the earth, its hull covered in thick vines, rusted metal plates peeled back like an open wound. It had been there for years, maybe decades, but the thing that made Roger's pulse quicken wasn't the wreckage itself. It was the bones scattered around the site. Half buried in the moss were the skeletal remains of at least 3 bodies, their bones picked clean, their weapons still clutched in bony fingers. Armor plating lay cracked and broken, the faded insignia of a long-forgotten crew barely visible beneath the grime. Roger crouched, picking up a rusted dog tag from one of the bodies. The name was worn away, unreadable, but the shape of it, the design, was unmistakably human. "They were like me," he muttered. "They never made it off this rock." Talon stood a few paces behind him, her expression unreadable. "Few do." Roger exhaled slowly, letting the weight of that settle in his chest. He had known the odds of survival were slim, but seeing the remains of those who had come before him, those who had failed, it put things into perspective in a way statistics never could. Standing, he turned back to her. "Why did you bring me here?" Talon's tail curled slightly, the movement slow, thoughtful. "You need to understand where you are. Xeris is not a world that forgives weakness. Those who come here do not leave. Your people came before you, and they died. You are no different." Roger studied her carefully, noting the way she watched him, the way she was measuring his reaction. He could feel the challenge in her words, the unspoken expectation that he would falter, that he would be just like the rest. But Roger Cade had never been one to follow the expected path. "I appreciate the warning," he said, brushing off the dirt from his hands. "But I don't intend to end up like them." Talon tilted her head, silver eyes gleaming. "Many have said the same." Roger smirked. "Yeah, well, I'm a stubborn bastard." For the first time, something flickered in her expression, something close to amusement, quickly buried beneath her usual impassiveness. She turned, motioning for him to follow once more. "Then prove it." And with that, they left the wreckage behind, stepping deeper into the unknown, into the heart of a world that did not welcome outsiders. Roger didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to die here. He wasn't going to be another set of bones in the dirt. And if Talon thought he was just another foolish human, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. The journey through the jungle continued in tense silence, the weight of the wreckage they had left behind lingering like a ghost in Roger's mind. The skeletons, the rusted remnants of another failed attempt at survival. He had seen plenty of death before, but something about this place felt different. Xeris did not just kill those who came unprepared. It consumed them, buried them, erased them. The jungle itself seemed to reclaim the dead, vines wrapping around broken armor, roots pushing through shattered skulls, as if the planet itself rejected any intrusion. The thought sent an involuntary shiver down his spine, but he forced it aside. He had no intention of meeting the same fate. Talon moved ahead of him without hesitation, weaving through the thick undergrowth with the ease of someone who belonged here, someone who had long since mastered the dangers that lurked in the shadows. Her tail moved in slow, deliberate arcs, an unspoken signal of awareness, control. It fascinated Roger in a way he wasn't sure he should acknowledge. The way her body language spoke volumes, even when her voice remained silent. She was a warrior, that much was clear, but she carried herself with the kind of restraint that only came with years of discipline. He had seen fighters before, hot-tempered, reckless, driven by the need to prove something. Talon was different. She knew exactly what she was capable of, and she had nothing to prove to anyone. Still, he couldn't shake the memory of the moment back at the wreckage. The way her gaze had lingered on him just a second longer than necessary, as if she were waiting for something, waiting to see if he would break, if he would crumble under the weight of the reality she had shown him. He hadn't. Roger exhaled sharply and quickened his pace, catching up to her as the jungle began to thin slightly, the trees giving way to a rocky incline that stretched toward a distant plateau. The ground was firmer here, the dense vegetation tapering off into clusters of jagged stones and patches of deep crimson moss. The air had a different scent now, something mineral-rich, almost metallic, and Roger realized they were nearing some kind of underground water source. "Where are we headed?" he finally asked, his voice cutting through the ambient hum of the jungle. Talon didn't look back. "Shelter." "Good, because as much as I love hiking through a death jungle, I'd rather not get eaten before I figure out how to fix my ship." She gave no reaction to his words, but something in the slight twitch of her tail made him wonder if she found his constant talking either amusing or irritating. He was willing to bet on the latter. They climbed the incline in steady silence, the heat pressing against Roger's back as the twin suns of Xeris cast long shadows across the terrain. The gravity was slightly heavier than Earth's, just enough that he felt it in his muscles, but not enough to slow him down. He had been on worse planets, endured worse odds. At least here, he wasn't dodging plasma fire or dealing with bounty hunters trying to collect on old debts. At the crest of the incline, Talon finally came to a halt, her posture shifting slightly, more alert. Roger followed her gaze and found himself looking at a hidden cave entrance nestled between the rocky outcroppings, its opening partially obscured by thick hanging vines. The mouth of the cave was wide enough for them to walk through comfortably, but it was the unnatural smoothness of the stone that caught Roger's attention. This wasn't just a natural formation. Someone had been here before. Talon pushed aside the vines and stepped inside without hesitation, her glowing silver eyes cutting through the dim interior as if the darkness didn't affect her. Roger followed, ducking slightly as he entered, his instincts on high alert. The moment he stepped inside, he felt the temperature drop, the cool air of a stark contrast to the humidity outside. The walls of the cave were lined with faint bioluminescent veins, casting an eerie blue-green glow that illuminated just enough to see. As they moved deeper, the space widened into a larger chamber, the ceiling arching high above them. Stone slabs, smoothed by time and use, were arranged in various formations, some resembling makeshift tables, others more like resting areas. It was clear this place had been used before, though whether by Talon herself or others like her, he couldn't yet tell. She turned to him then, arms crossed over her chest, studying him with that same unreadable intensity. "This is where you will stay." Roger arched a brow. "Not exactly a five-star resort, but I've slept in worse places." He took a few steps further in, running a hand along one of the stone surfaces. It was cool to the touch, smooth in a way that suggested deliberate craftsmanship. "This place, who built it?" Talon's gaze didn't waver. "Long before my time. Others lived here. Warriors, exiles, those who had no place among the cities. Xeris does not forgive weakness, but not all who are cast out deserve their fate." There was something in her voice then, something layered beneath the usual stoicism, a flicker of something personal. Roger didn't push, not yet. Instead, he exhaled and leaned against the stone, stretching out his legs as he took in his surroundings. "So, what now?" he asked, looking up at her. "I figure I've got two options. Either I find a way to fix my ship, or I settle in and start learning how to fight jungle monsters for breakfast." Talon's expression didn't change. "Your ship is beyond repair." Roger frowned. "You don't know that. I just need tow." She stepped closer, cutting him off with the sheer finality of her presence. "I know." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Your kind does not last long here. The jungle is not your enemy. Xeris itself is. It will break you. The air you breathe, the water you drink, the ground beneath your feet, everything will work against you. If you wish to survive, you will listen." Roger met her gaze, reading the certainty in her expression, the absolute conviction that came from knowing this world better than anyone else. He wasn't an idiot. He knew when to push back and when to shut up and learn. Right now, he was in no position to argue. "All right," he said, nodding slightly. "I'm listening." Talon regarded him for another moment before stepping back, her posture relaxing just enough to suggest approval. "Then we begin at first light." Roger smirked, letting his head rest back against the stone. "Looking forward to it." She said nothing, simply turning away and moving toward the far end of the chamber, where another passage led deeper into the cave. For now, she would let him rest. But Roger knew this was only the beginning. Xeris was not a place for the weak, and if he wanted to make it out alive, he would have to prove that he belonged. Roger woke to the sound of distant thunder, a deep rolling growl that vibrated through the cave walls. For a moment, he was disoriented, his mind still caught between the wreckage of his ship and the memory of those long-dead explorers whose bones had been swallowed by the jungle. But then reality set in. The damp air, the faint glow of the bioluminescent veins in the stone, and the sharp presence of Talon, who sat across the chamber, her form still, her silver eyes reflecting the dim light like liquid mercury. She hadn't been sleeping. He wondered if she ever did.